sticking with us, and sorry for the delay. For those of you who are not over in the second track or who don't know me from elsewhere, I'm Ian Mason. I'm Director of Operations at Futo. Thanks again for everybody coming here. We're going to close with our first ever panel. It's everybody here except for Nick, I believe you've all been introduced to, so allow me to introduce Nicholas Merrill, a giant in this space, founder of the Calix Institute in 1995, the first man to refuse a national security letter under the Patriot Act, which, for those of you Zoomers who are too young to remember, was the civil liberties issue of its day. We're proud sponsors at Futo of the Calix Institute, and if you are looking to do a modern phone, a modern Android open source project phone, with as little of Google's involvement as you can, Calix is a great option you should definitely check out. Like I say, everybody else I think you've been introduced to, so I will introduce the topic, which is why hasn't FOSS won? Why hasn't the open source movement, which it seems to be part of its progress, of its purpose to sort of unseat things like big tech that exists today? So I realize that the title begs the question, so we'll rectify that sin, and I'll pass the first question to Nick, who I think has been around the open source scene longer than anybody else here. So has FOSS won?
FOSS has not won, but I feel like it's creating maybe a false dichotomy that it's not, there's never going to be like a moment where like we've won, they've lost, it's over. Someone once said that any fight worth fighting never stays won. So you're going to end up refighting the same fights every 20 years. And I do think that there's some really amazing stuff going on now with the open source movement in AI, for instance. You can do all kinds of stuff at home with a GPU, using AI models that are all open source, using all open source software that you can never do with big tech, that big tech would never let you do. Android, we make our own version of Android, which is all focused on privacy. We can do that because Android open source project is open. It's based on the Linux kernel. If you look at macOS, underneath it, it's Darwin. It's an open kernel. It's based on BSD, userland. It's, there's a lot of, open source is ubiquitous throughout big tech. They depend on it. They contribute to it. So I feel like it's a gray area. I think that one of the big things that maybe the free software movement has to do, though, is figure out better financial models. Because ultimately, I'm very cynical at this point, and I kind of feel like to really win big political battles, you need to outbribe Congress, essentially. Like if big tech is going to pay Congress $1 billion, we might have to pay them $2 billion. But that's a super cynical way of looking at it. But it's also, I truly believe it. I'm not playing. So that's I think something we should do, and that's kind of why I'm really happy to see a lot of people that I talk to here talk about their business models that they're working on with free software. Yeah.
If anybody else wants to jump in on any question, definitely go for it, but I think we can move on. So what is FOSS to begin with? I know this is something that has occupied an inordinate amount of time in internal discussions at Futo. What does open source mean? There are people who have, as I understand, the open source initiative, tried to trademark the term at some point and sort of cement legally their own definition of it, and that's been unsuccessful. What does open source mean to you? And Eron, I'm going to start with you, but I hope everybody jumps in. What does it mean to you, and how might it be different from other definitions that are out there?
I mean, I'm kind of coming at this from an outsider's point of view, at least before like a few years ago. When we started Yahoo, we would just we were like, wow, we're using so much open source software. This is like, these guys are really good. We're using FreeBSD for servers. And, it was, we were kind of like feeling guilty, I would say sometimes, because there were lots of like, the first 10 engineers at Yahoo made a lot more money than anyone working on FreeBSD. So, as far as, I just kind of ignored the issue until recently. But kind of looking at how, the problems Futo is trying to solve, like, it's obvious to me that, we have to know what our computers, if we are going to own our computers, we have to know what they're doing. So that means there can't be any obfuscation of what the software is doing. Like, the programmer can't do things to make it harder for us to know what our computers are doing. So that's basically it. I thought this was called open source. I've been told by other people that this is not open source. This is like maybe source available or something. But if I go and I talk to, a random person on the street, which, Futo wants to build software that has, hundreds of millions of users, less than 1% of those users, they some of them will know what open source means. None of them will have even heard this like source available thing. So I've just been kind of open source, and I've been upsetting some people, I guess, because of this. But maybe to me it doesn't really matter that much. Like, maybe we'll just call it Futo-y software. Futo-y software is software that you can run, and you can rest assured there's no hidden agenda. We don't want there to be a hidden agenda when you're running software. It's that simple.
So I think it's a good follow-up to that, and anybody can jump in, but Eron, if nobody else does, can you effectively separate the different parts of what's come to be accepted as free and open source software? Can you separate the four freedoms? Can you separate the OSI definition, which begins with open source is not just source you can see? I'm paraphrasing. The community ownership model, community contribution. Can these things be separated out without fatally injuring the project at hand from a FOSS perspective?
So I can speak from experience there. I worked for many years on game technology that followed almost exactly that model. You license the technology from the company. You get both precompiled binaries if you just don't want to deal with it, or you get the full source code so that you can compile it yourself or debug it yourself or do anything you want. And the license regime is just such that it's like, okay, anyone can purchase that and they get the source, but you're not allowed to just like freely post it and redistribute it or sell it as your own or any of those sorts of things. And that worked fantastically. It was the entire foundation of a company. That company was worth a lot of money, and it employed people, right? So that model definitely works. You can at least extract I guess I would say, to my mind, the most important part of open source, which is that a customer knows that they're not just going to be left with nothing if you fold or sell or change your software in some horrible way. They still have this existing license to use this piece of software and modify that source as they need to keep doing what they're doing. So I think at least that part, we have plenty of evidence that it can be extracted pretty cleanly.
I was going to say, like, there's a bunch of different models that can work, and that's definitely one. But I was going to say, like, the Linux model, all GPL and completely free. I'm having a hard time thinking of any free software project that's been more successful than Linux. So many governments around the world are using it. So many corporations are using it. So many devices, and it's under the GPL license, so it's like, it proves to me, I think, that you can be under such a permissive license and be like the most successful thing in the world. But yeah, I do think that there's also room for like 100 million other variations and licenses.
Okay. I'll move on to a question for Lewis. I know you, through your YouTube channel and then even your work with Futo, then have interacted with 100 open source projects, 100 software projects, many of which adhere strictly to FOSS orthodoxy. In those projects, have you seen an overarching theme of what projects gain by getting that seal of approval, getting that blue ribbon as a real FOSS project with all the things we've discussed: four freedoms, OSI, community contribution, if not ownership?
Yeah, I guess it's just the trust of the people that are using the software. I don't even necessarily see it as, let's say, open source has necessarily failed. I guess it would depend on specifically how you're looking at it. Like, almost every website on the internet is using Apache for hosting. For a good 10 years, every website I clicked on was using WordPress. For like a while before everybody got obsessed with Amazon. And even now, almost every single website that's like a medium-sized business not using Amazon is usually using some sort of Magento Community Edition, usually without the last 6 years of security patches, but that's its own issue. You'll have, including by, God forbid, you have OpenSSL. Almost everybody that's watching a pirated movie is using VLC. There are all these little areas where open source is doing well. It's mostly in these niche pieces of software where it sucks. Like, if I want to edit video and I want to use Kdenlive, in 2024, I can't use audio plugins. It's just, there's so many, in all these little niche areas of software, like that's where the open source stuff starts to be stuff that doesn't have a lot of users or is bad. And I remember, I saw like that applied for a grant. I look up the nonprofit and I see KDEEV. It was something like 150 or 200,000 euros a year. And it's this weird problem because I don't want to pay for Kdenlive when I can't do stuff in it that other video editors were doing in 2002, like just put an audio plugin on a track. But simultaneously, they need somebody to pay somebody to develop that functionality. But so it's like this problem of the tragedy of the commons, or the prisoner's dilemma of like, I'm not paying for that until it has this. They need the money in order to get it. And it just kind of turns into this circular problem with all these pieces of software that have all this potential, but they're like missing the last 15 to 25% that would actually make it worth it for me to pay. I don't know how you get that in the niche pieces of software the same way that you get it with, Apache, MariaDB, Magento Community Edition.
It's true. You hear about so many like low-level Unix tools that are like maintained by one person, and that person has never really been supported by anyone and never really gotten the support they needed. And literally, the whole internet depends on this tool working. So that figuring out how to solve that and how to somehow monetize these projects or somehow encourage entities, enterprises, whoever's benefiting from this software to support them is really going to be key, I think. But yeah, I just heard that too many times to count, and it's really kind of terrifying sometimes. You made me think about it with OpenSSL.
Like FFM, like I think YouTube has gotten more value out of FFmpeg than FFmpeg has gotten out of Google. Just a slight bit.
So Casey, I'll go back to you for the flip side of the same question. Then, in your experience, have you seen projects suffer, and how when they have bent over backwards to do the checklist, to get everything with open source right, get totally right with the community, so to speak, especially in projects that maybe have a potential to be Futo-y, as it were?
Well, I guess I would say that I'm not sure that's the most interesting lens to look at what happens when you open source software. Because in general, I think, as the previous comments have already illuminated, the real problem with open source is not so much that there's maybe too much effort or too much too many problems that will happen if you open source your program. The real problem to me is more that you are essentially forfeiting an incredible amount of important power and control, if you will, that is actually crucial to shaping how the world works. And just to give a very simple example, Linux, as you just said, how much say did Linus Torvalds have in whether or not Parler got kicked off of Amazon Web Services, even though there's no way Amazon exists without Linux? Like, that never would happen, right? The answer is, of course, he had no say in it. He probably was never consulted, probably didn't even know it happened, right? And so what happens is, when you decide that you're going to give something away for free in some version like that, so that other people can build things on it, what seems to happen is they do build things on it, they take all the power and control for themselves, and even though your contribution by percentage may be significantly higher than theirs, building an operating system versus building Amazon Web Services, right? At least on the software side, it ends up with a bunch of people sitting in a room like we are now talking about how you start to take back ownership of your computers. Well, all of the ownership would have already been ours if the programmers had asserted that power and control for themselves, but instead we didn't. So to me, it's a much bigger question than just what happens to a project. The problem is money, power, control, they're all related, and when you give that up, no one has figured out how to avoid the situation we now find ourselves in, which is other people will take that work, repurpose it for their own ends, and then cut you out of the actual power and control that would have made a huge difference if you were there to have steered it differently. So I guess that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just chime in on this point. One of the things that we wanted to do with GreyJ was make sure that nobody puts adware into it and then puts a knockoff version of it in like some store in India. This is actually against many open source zealots. They actually are very unhappy if you try to put that condition on people that you're not allowed. Like, yeah, you can look at the source, you can rebuild it, you can know exactly what our app is doing. But if you add malware on it, you're not allowed to distribute that, and like we're going to sue you if you do that. We got, you know, a lot of people were unhappy with that, and that's why we're not even sure if we can call we're not even sure if we should call it open source or not because of that. Like, you would think these people would be happy for us to be joining them, but if they're going to be upset at us calling ourselves open source, I don't know what we're going to do.
Well, I liked your idea of it's called Futo-y or Futo-ish software or something. I mean, I really think people need to wake up to this reality, because it is a reality, and we are facing real serious problems today, especially as programmers who are used to this particular way of doing things, where a lot of work that programmers have done then gets repurposed to have a lot of people who don't share any of the same values as the programmers who originally made the projects on which they depend. They then do things that those programmers would really not have wanted done. And I think that part of the problem is just that case isn't getting made loudly enough. I think once people kind of start to understand that really this is, the state we're in now is because of that lack of ownership that people had, I think that would perhaps be a good way to compel people to think about alternative models. Still, like you said, source available or whatever, or Futo-y, there is a thing we do want, which is the ability to modify, the ability to sort of have that ownership and not have it taken away to a whim, but not, oh, you can take this and repurpose it for means exactly opposite of what it was initially designed to do.
I mean, I'd also like to point out that the other aspect that I don't want to ignore is the pride of ownership of the programmer. You shouldn't put a programmer in a situation where like either I'm like almost like a communist and I'm just like programming things for the community, or I'm solely proprietary and I can't ever have my source like out there. Like, maybe I want to have a path for a programmer to be able to create great things that they're proud of, and that, yeah, they can wield control over, because they did spend a lot of time on it, and they are really the only contributor for it. Maybe there's other people helping them, but yeah, they did 99% of the work, and they might not, you know, like you said, like the Linux example at AWS. Maybe they don't like, you know, I think the environmentalists get mad when like somebody uses their thing, whatever, you know, whatever is your cause. It's like you have that pride of ownership. You express yourself with your software. I don't want to like get too like, you're not really an artist, but you're kind of an artist, sure. As a programmer, you're kind of an artist.
I mean, the thing about having licenses that disallow commercial use, to me, as someone who runs an open source project and who has to look for ways to make it sustainable, is that I feel like eliminating the possibility of commercial forks of things means that it makes sustainability harder. It can make sustainability harder. If you can't start with an open source project, like I started with the Android open source project, which Google gives away, added a privacy layer on top, and because of the licensing, which is all either Apache 2 or MIT, there's nothing restricting me from making a new project, naming it something, and making it commercial and selling it. So I feel like in some ways, the danger of not allowing commercialization could mean that you're undermining sustainability and potentially innovation, because people won't want to work on the software if they won't be able to like feed themselves with it.
Well, I think also it's possibly going too far to say we don't want to commercialize this thing, right? Ideally, if we could find some way for the money to simply flow correctly, that would be the best option, right? So that way, when Amazon does build an empire out of your software that you've written, you get a significant chunk of that back for you, because then when we do have to pay Congress $2 billion, Linus has it, and he can, right? Because that's the reality of how the world works. And so if that money was flowing properly, and it wasn't that like, oh, you know, the people who make this thing on the back of your software, they all get billions and billions of dollars and you get $100,000. If you had those metrics more adjusted for the people who actually did the work, then I think that to me solves the problem, right? It's unclear how exactly you do that, but it does then makes the power and control flow properly to the people who actually did the work, and it allows their values to be reflected in the outcome, which of course ends up, at least in the way that the world runs currently, money is a big part of that. So
absolutely, yeah, we can't deny that. Yeah, no, I'm just thinking more about the different business models that were built around Linux. Like maybe the most obvious example would be Red Hat and their, the amount of money that they've made off doing support and also building better tooling and all the stuff that they've done to make it easier to deploy. That has made it kind of so ubiquitous in finance and all the different places where it's used. But of course, going back to your point, little, if any of that went back to Linux.
Yeah, I'm sure some did, right?
Maybe,
like,
sure.
but it's not commensurate, and
No,
I think that's
no.
usually the way it is. It's like most of the time something goes back,
Yeah.
but the ratios, I think, to an observer who was trying to fairly assess how much work was required from each of the participants in a project, simply wouldn't think the values were. You get people who've done very little by comparison. I guess the best example might be something like Facebook. If you think about the entire stack that was necessary for Mark Zuckerberg to get that started, almost none of it was his, right? Almost all of it was hard work by other people, whether it's Linux, whether it's the web server, whether it's PHP, whatever. None of those people have even a fraction of the amount of Facebook ownership that he does. And so as a result, their values are not reflected, even though they were very critical in the production of that piece of software. So that's really the thing that I always come back to as being concerned about and would like to see a solution to, preferably one that doesn't destroy the other positive aspects of open source, such as the reliability, the sense of ownership, and so on.
But actually, that kind of made me remember way back to the first thing I ever did, which was I set up one of the first ISPs in New York City, like 1994. And it was obvious I was going to run it on Unix. And at that time, it was like the first day that you could get an installable Linux distro. So the only thing that had previously been available was BSDI, which was a commercial BSD, and it cost like 10 grand for one machine. That was the license fee. And I didn't have 10 grand. And so I ended up being able to install Slackware Linux on a stack of 94 floppies. I had to write 94 floppies and insert one after the next and hope that not one of the 94 had a bad block, which thank God none of them did, because I don't know how I would have troubleshot that. But I was thinking about it, that like the fact that it was free software enabled me to start a business, which ultimately led to being like the successful-ish, upstanding adult that I am now, that's had a whole career based on this stuff. And that maybe if only BSDI or SunOS or some other commercial solution had been the only thing available to me, SunOS would have been out of the question. It would have been way more than BSDI. So like I would have been kind of just kept out of the tech sector. And it was, when I've met people, like I met Stallman and I told him, I was like, oh, it's all because of your work. I appreciated that I have, a career and stuff. And he told me, God damn it, call it GNU Linux or whatever. He yelled at me and he launched into that whole thing.
Seriously?
Dead serious, 100%. But
He did the same shit with me on the phone, man.
yes. But
I just put my phone down, walked away for 10 minutes.
But despite that, I know he's nuts. But I still appreciate his dedication and all that. But I guess what I'm saying is like I feel like that letting people use all this software for free is just good for creating a middle class across the world, for helping people start small businesses, for helping people get in with like almost nothing, and so because it helped me get started in my tech career, I feel like really like a soft spot in my heart for.
What about an alternative world though, where Linux, you did have to pay a fee for Linux, but it was still kind of all open and you could start using it without paying anybody, and Linux only comes after you once you're successful? Would that have worked out?
It might have. Yeah, I think so. That could have worked. I'm not saying it couldn't have. That could have worked just as well, I suppose. But I don't think he was that kind of a business genius to think of it that way either.
Well, also, there's other models you can choose, right? You can choose royalty-based models. You can have alternatives for people where it's like, because if the problem you're trying to solve is Facebook builds a $1 trillion company on your software and you get nothing. Well, the goal is to make that be very expensive for Facebook so that they have to give you a significant share of that money. But if someone's never going to do that, you don't really need to guard against that. So something that's, giving people options that are more like, like if you're going to start a business, it's free for the first $100,000 of your income. Like, we're not going to ask you to pay anything. And in the game industry, these kinds of license models exist all over the place. You see things in game engines and stuff like that. It's very common. It's like, look, you can use the whole thing for free. When you ship, we take 5%, something like that, right? And I feel like those are better economic models for things like this because, you really don't want to prevent startups from using this technology or individuals from using this technology just to do experimentation in their own stuff. So upfront fees usually don't do a good job of capturing it, generally speaking.
I can totally see how that model could work. But then I'm thinking about how many people freely and willingly send in, pull requests and code to open projects like Linux, which they probably wouldn't do if someone else was going to be making the license fee unless there was some kind of revenue share thing, maybe. But that would get super complicated super fast, since there was probably like one line in the kernel written by this one person 30 years ago or whatever. There's a lot of really old legacy stuff in there, but I'm thinking specifically about just different governments that have contributed to it. I mean, even as creepy as it is, like NSA has contributed a lot of stuff to kernel security. And one of the arguments I always heard of like why Linux could arguably be one of the most secure free Unixes is because of the amount of eyeballs that look at it. And the reason why NSA wanted to use it for themselves was because of that, because of how highly competitive it is. Like all the, every country in the world has these giant supercomputer clusters. They all run Linux, and they all are trying to steal each other's nuclear secrets and mapping secrets and all the stuff that they're doing. So it's like they all have this weird detente of like they all are looking at each other, wanting to steal the info from each other and wanting to protect themselves. So it's sort of like that antagonism dynamic to me makes it seem more trustworthy than something that's more closed.
Yeah, I guess, but I'm not really sure that those things still wouldn't happen, because the majority of the reason that they do those things is because because the source is available. It's not really because of much else, right? I mean, they can't submit a pull request for Microsoft. It's probably the reason they don't. I think the US government probably would submit a lot of pull requests for Microsoft Windows if they could, right? So I'm not really sure. At least when I've seen projects that have a GitHub that's private, they still get tons of pull requests from their customers. So I think it's not that big of a risk, right? Getting the economic model fair is always difficult because, to your point, maybe I'll switch it around a little and say something that is like would be concerning to me. It's like, well, but what happens if someone does a ton of work on this thing and they're not sharing in any of those economic benefits, right? Which is the whole thing we were trying to prevent. So that's still a problem, right? Because if people are just giving their work to this for free and they never ask for anything back, well, they're getting cut out. And, could we do something better where if you're found to be a material contributor, like you get some of that. So I'm not saying it's easy, but is it really that big of a practical barrier that it would be something that's has a royalty attached to it? I don't think it would create that big of a problem, to be completely honest. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but
I don't know. I'm just thinking about the like millions of hours that people put into like making, Emacs and Vim and all the different editors and stuff like that. And like, how are they ever really going to capitalize on that? You know what I mean? And some of the tools like Netcat or whatever, like just little tools that but actually are huge. Nmap, whatever, network tools, stuff like that. Like I feel like some of it could be capitalized on, but some of it may not have the possibility. At least I can't envision the business model that you can make it sustainable.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to do it for everything, right? Like it's probably like at some point you get down to a certain level where it's like, look, unless we make some amazing future AI that just like the ultimate work understanding AI that knows exactly how hard everyone worked on everything. But yes, assuming that we don't have some magical future, yeah, I think mainly...
That's a good idea, though. I like that. I like the magical AI. Maybe that's something Futo could fund.
I think we got time to shift gears in this just sort of one more time. There's a topic that you kind of all have touched on, but I'd like you to all get to weigh in on a little more fully. Casey, I feel like you get the last word here. Nick, you're welcome to take the first on this. And it's the subject of open source capture. And I think there's kind of two angles of this. Casey, what you called repurposing earlier, this sort of tragedy of the commons, raiding the work of thousands of developers and millions of man hours, and then turning it into a monster that we know. And the other is sort of the what I'll call like financial capture. The fact that a lot of these otherwise not particularly profitable companies or nonprofits wind up receiving a ton of their money. And I think we can all name examples of supposedly open source projects that are, for all intents and purposes, adjuncts of the tech oligopoly at this point. Is this preventable, and if so, how? How is it best to steer open source projects to not suffer capture?
I guess I'm not 100% understanding who you're meaning. I'm like, in my mind, it sounds like you're talking about Mozilla.
Yeah.
Basically. I don't know. Yeah, no, I'm just trying to understand, because I feel like in my mind I can't wrap my mind around it unless I understand. I mean, I don't know. I like their business model. I wanted to copy it. I like the idea of a nonprofit that owns a for-profit, and I thought about doing it at one time. I never did end up doing it, but I like the idea of taking advantage of the different properties that a for-profit and a nonprofit has to obtain different options and be able to further a goal. But I guess I'm so old. I remember when there was just Netscape, and then there was there wasn't like browser competition, and I don't know. I kind of like seeing all the different options out there, and then the business model that Mozilla built. I mean, it's kind of gross, but I think a bunch of Google has corrupted a bunch of places by paying them off to make Google be their default search engine. And with our phones, we're pushing all the alternative ones, DuckDuckGo or whatever, Start Page, all that kind of thing. But I don't know. I guess in my mind, I don't hold it against Mozilla what they did, because it seemed like I have a thing where I appreciate something, which I always call it like the evil super genius. Like I'm like, okay, that's kind of messed up, but I also have to tip my hat. Like that was pretty smart. You know what I mean? So like I have a way of holding both things in my mind at the same time. That like I'm not sure I like how they did it, but I gotta respect the hustle, kind of a thing.
Lewis, did you want to weigh in on any of this capture of open source? Ways to prevent it, how serious of a problem it is?
I mean, when it comes to Firefox, I don't know how much of this is what is the worst part of it? Is the idea that if you're making so much money, regardless of the software being competitive or good, that you won't be incentivized to hire new engineers, or is it something more malicious? Or why would you say Firefox has 2 or 3% dwindling market share?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer, but it probably comes down to money somehow. But it's a gigantic organization, right? They employ like umpteen thousand people all over the world, and they hold these giant Moz Fest things, and they seem to result in money trickling down into like a million other projects. And they had that, Thunderbird and all these other spin-off things that are kind of cool. And I don't know. Someone tell me what's so bad about it. I don't know.
Like I've been using Thunderbird for the past 15 years, and I've noticed that it really doesn't matter how you try to train the junk filter. It has not worked for 15 years. And I just kind of wonder, if you weren't getting tens of millions of dollars, regardless of whether the software was amazing or not, because you know that you're going to get that, again, the incentive structure to hire somebody that may, I don't know if I at my own company would, have difficult conversations with an employee that's not really performing to a certain standard if I knew I was kind of getting money anyway. Because I'm trying to, I hear what you're saying, which is, they have this capture where Google and other closed source companies that are directly competing with them are donating tons of money. But I can't make but I want to know, what is the direct connection between that and you having garbage market share after 15 years? That's a theory of mine, but I'm just pulling that out of my ass.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I sometimes I'm super cynical about stuff, and other times I feel like overly unrealistic and romantic about it, and I'm like, oh, that's like Robin Hood. They're like stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. This is super cool. So on some level, I can view Mozilla in that light. They're not exactly stealing from Google. Google's willingly, bribing them to put their browser as their search engine as the top search engine or the only search engine in their browser. But I I don't know. I hear what you're saying about Thunderbird, but I don't know. I've also been using it that long, and I don't know. I think I had a problem once where it deleted a bunch of my stuff, but I have like 25 years of email in it, and it's a gigantic amount of data. So I kind of like see how that's not a super easy problem. And I don't know. That was like at least 15 years ago. I don't hold it against them, but
like,
I think it's
where
okay.
do you draw the
good.
line? Where do you draw the line between they're getting tens of millions of dollars from Google and they have no
Well, it's
market share,
hundreds.
and
It's
Google's
hundreds
like,
of millions.
yeah, okay. Like, where do you draw the line between, like, how do you draw a direct line between they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars from Google, Chrome has all this market share, and Firefox is 3%? Because like I see, Google, the idea that they're capturing this product, there has to be a method, there has to be a theory that connects to why their market share is dwindling and just close to nothing, and them giving money. Like, mine was a theory. I don't know if it's a true theory or not. It's just like thinking as a business owner. I just wouldn't really care if my employee is the most productive or competitive if I knew I was going to get paid anyway. But I'm sure there's other competing theories. Like, what do you think is the direct relationship, if any, between Google giving Mozilla's nonprofit this much money and them having 2 or 3% market share and not being competitive? Because you've said many times, I've heard you like, Firefox is losing. This is bad.
Yeah, I mean, well, if I'm a top-notch engineer at Mozilla, Google has access to hire me to work for Google and pay me a lot more than I'm making at Mozilla. It's that simple. So Google will be taking all the best engineers. Like, as a company, you have put yourself in a position where all your best engineers are moving to your competition.
But do you have to donate to the company in order for that to happen? Like, if I was a recruiter that worked at Google, couldn't I just show up to a MozFest or something and say, like, what are you making? I'll pay you 3 times as much to work on this. Like, I don't even know if the donations have to actually happen for this to occur.
Well, the donations might happen just so there appears to be competition, right? So one of the things that, is kind of classic in these kind of industries is like, we don't want a government to look down and see only Chrome, because then all of a sudden we get regulated. So we'll just keep funding Firefox or whoever else is the person who we can most visibly fund, and then that way there's choice in the browser market, quote unquote, right? So I have no idea if this is actually true, but I could totally believe that one reason for that, because we've seen it before, Microsoft has done things like this in the past, where it's like they just want to keep someone who is not particularly threatening, but is at least there to just kind of make it so that it's not a complete monopoly, right? In this case, it doesn't seem to have worked because they've gotten down so low. But
how much of that is, the whole thing of like nobody knows or cares about knowing versus like it actually sucks? Like, for instance, you have the image developers there. Like, I think that that's better than Google Photos, and it's free and it's open source and it actually works better. Unlike the Kden Live example, like there's all this money that would have to be put into it to code all these features where I would pay for it. I would pay for that as it is. Like, is it that people don't know that it exists, or is it just garbage? Like, I don't know. You've said some. Let me just. The nice way to put it is, I believe Firefox is not your preference, but like, I've used it. Like, it works. I can do everything I need to do. I have my ad blocker. I have my script blocker. It loads pages fast. Like, is it really not a choice, or is it just a choice that nobody chooses because it's not the default, or they don't know what it is, or something like that?
Well, I mean, to the extent, we're just getting started here at Futo. We're going to have open source projects that, or whatever you want, Futo-y source first, maybe. Do you guys like source first? We're going to have projects that may actually, if we're not, if we don't have tens of millions of users in our projects in 10 years, I'm going to be very disappointed. We're going to have to solve those problems. We're going to have to make sure that we have revenue directly from the consumers who are using our software. Because if we don't have that revenue directly from the consumers using our software, we're not going to be able to compete in the long term.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left here, but Eron, I think you kind of preempted me there. I was about to give you the last word to say kind of where Futo fits in with this, and I think you've kind of nailed that already. So any further words on the future of Futo? Close out this panel and the conference.
I don't know. I hope we succeed. Like, I hope I hope you help us succeed.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the panelists.